The Lord is my shepherd. That's relationship. I shall not want. That's supply. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. That's rest. He leadeth me beside still waters. That's refreshment. He restoreth my soul. That's healing. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness. That's guidance. For his name's sake, that's purpose. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that's testing. I will fear no evil, that's protection. For thou art with me, that's faithfulness. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me, that's discipline. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies, that's hope. Thou anointed my head with oil, that's consecration. My cup runneth over, that's abundance. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, that's blessings. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord, that's security. Forever, that's eternity.
Rugged wilderness covers much of Israel. And it's in this very hostile environment that God chose to carry out his plan of salvation for us as mankind. The Judea wilderness to the east and the south, the Negev wilderness way down in the south of Israel, played a significant role in shaping the biblical history and the images and metaphors God chose to use to reveal himself to his people. It was out of this wilderness context that God revealed his nature to his original people. Now, the wilderness was home then, and it is still home today in the 21st century to nomadic shepherds. We call them Bedouin. In biblical times, the writers called them names like the Amalekites, the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, and so forth. Nomadic, sheep-herding, goat-herding people. So we shouldn't be surprised that the nation of Israel always saw God as their shepherd. First and foremost, their God was a shepherd, because that's the way they'd always viewed their patriarchs. You know, Abraham, their forefather, Moses, their lawgiver, David, their greatest ever king and the man after God's own heart, were all prepared for the missions God had for them while they were shepherds, spending time in the wilderness, herding sheep and goats. Now, Israel's wilderness abounds with rocks and hills and wadis. We call them perhaps valleys, wadis in the Middle East. The climate is one of extremes. If you're there at this time of the year, July, in Israel, in Jordan, in any of the Middle Eastern countries, as I was nearly 20 years ago, way back in 2004 was the first of my journeys to Israel. I've been there 3 times. I was there in June. The temperatures are scorching out in the wilderness areas, in the Judea wilderness. Temperatures can approach 50 degrees centigrade if you're out in the sun. And at night, it can be extremely cold. It's a very harsh place to be, the wilderness. And it's in that context that God called his people to live. Why? I've got an idea it was because he wanted them to trust him for everything that they needed day by day. Because in such a wilderness, it's not an easy place to live. Ooh. Here's a little bit of a mud map of the nation of Israel, if you like, with just some key towns and features that you're probably familiar with if you've read your Bibles from time to time, no doubt. Down south there, where the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, we've got a place of Bethlehem. Jerusalem's not there. It's just a handful of kilometres away from Bethlehem. And it's to the east there towards the Dead Sea, and the south that the Judea wilderness is in. And it's a very, very arid area to this very day. Whoops, I'm going too quick here. Go back again. Sorry, I'll get used to this quicker. This was a photo I took out the bus window as we drove from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And we're dropping down nearly 4,000 feet in elevation. And on the way, this was the scenery in July in Israel. This is the Judea wilderness. You can see it's not a very inviting place to be. And yet all those tracks are made by the sheep and the goats of the Bedouin who still raise their sheep and goats in the same way King David did in the same area 3,000 years ago. They are still farming that way. Again, there's a little relief map, if you like. You can see Jerusalem's perched up high in the central mountain ridge range of Israel. And if you go to the west, you get to the fertile valleys of the Mediterranean Sea. And if you go east, you come up over the top and then you drop vertically straight down to the Dead Sea about 1,000, 1,100 feet below sea level. And the climate is one of real extremes. This then is the context of David's 23rd Psalm. Now, we read it. I'm not going to read it again. You're very familiar with. But this morning I want to focus on three words: shepherd, green pastures, and still or quiet waters, depending on the translation you're using. And how can those words relate to us today in the same context as David would have understood them when he wrote them? He wrote these out of his relationship with his God. We interpret them a little different from time to time. This is the way David saw it. The Lord is my shepherd, he said. I lack nothing. David's using imagery here born out of his lifestyle. Now, the shepherding theme is really common in the Bible. It occurs more than 200 times in the Old Testament, and it occurs on at least 15 times in the New Testament. It's a very common theme. And it's interesting to note, I think, that this image of the shepherd and the sheep, or the sheep and the goats, is the image God chose to explain his relationship with his people, an image I still think is relevant today. Now, our image of a sheep farmer, now, of all the places in Victoria I could go and talk about sheep, this is probably the Mecca, isn't it? Yep. Absolutely. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on sheep and tell you people about sheep, but I do know a little bit. I grew up in Horsham, not far from here, far north, and there were a few sheep around when I was growing up and going to school in the 1970s. And when I was a youngster, my parents used to take me out to a little place just south of Horsham off the Henny Highway there, a place called Wonwanda. It had a footy team when I was a kid. It doesn't anymore. There's not much there, but they did have a footy oval. And on that footy oval each year, they ran the Kelpie sheepdog trials, which my parents took me to, and I was in awe of their dogs. Of all the intelligent creatures on planet Earth, the Kelpie dog's got to be right up there, doesn't it? An amazing dog to see working around sheep and herding them through pens and in and out things. And I grew up with a black and white collie Kelpie cross working dog off a farm around Horsham. So I know how smart these dogs are, how beautiful they are, how faithful they are, and how good they are at doing that job. Driving sheep where you want them to do, and just with a whistle or two or a word or two from the farmer, and the dog obeys obediently, and the sheep obey the dog, and they get where they want to be. Can you please take that image and erase it from your mind when you read the 23rd Psalm? I'll come back to that. Now, there might be some endearing qualities about sheep, and I know their wool we can't do without. But they're not the smartest animal on the farm, are they? No, they're not the dumbest, but they're not the smartest. And particularly in the Middle East, the people there tell me that if the sheep are away from the flock, they're not going to survive very long on their own. They're not real good at finding food, particularly out in the wilderness area, or finding water, or protecting themselves when predators come. They lack smart big claws, and they lack the sharp teeth, and they lack the speed, and they lack the endurance to outrun predators, and they're pretty vulnerable. They get into water that's often hard for them to get out again. They're not that capable of defence. They need the shepherd. And this is what David's writing about. Let me share with you a few verses, not all 200 from the Old Testament, about shepherds and sheep and God, that image that God wants us to be familiar with in our relationship with him, I believe, but just three. The first one from Psalm 78, 52 and 53. The psalmist here says, "But he brought his people out like a flock, and he led them like sheep through the wilderness. He guided them safely, so they were unafraid, but the sea engulfed their enemies." The psalmist is reminding them, the people of the time, of God bringing his children out of Egypt, of course, and escaping Pharaoh through the sea. Psalm 100 verse 3. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Time and again, God is saying, I am your shepherd. You are my sheep. What can we learn about the shepherd and the sheep from Jesus' time and even before that enable us to better enrich our relationship with God today? My final one's from the New Testament, John chapter 10, verses 1 to 5. Here's Jesus talking. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. He leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognise a stranger's voice. The shepherd leads and the sheep follow. That's an interesting concept, isn't it? One that I'm not used to here in Australia when I think of shepherds and sheep, or the farmers and the sheep, or farmers and goats. We don't normally lead them. We generally drive them, herd them. Why do the sheep follow the shepherd? Well, we'll come back to that. In Moses' time leading in the wilderness, Exodus tells us that God went ahead of the people and they followed him. This could be translated from the Hebrew as God walked ahead of them. So in a very real way, the people of Israel saw their God as a shepherd who led them. He went in front and they, the sheep, they, the people, followed behind. Why? Because it was in God that they had everything. They would find everything. Their daily needs would be met by the one who went before them and led them to the places they needed to go. Because the ancient Eastern people's minds, the Middle Eastern minds, had very little words for the abstract, they always thought and wrote in concrete terms. They talked about God walking ahead in a very literal way. In Moses' time, God went ahead of them as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And they used the words, that is our God walking ahead of us. So the shepherd walks ahead, the sheep follow. Verse 2, he makes me lie down in green pastures. Now, the regions where shepherds live in Israel today, as in the times of the Bible, there were 2 seasons only in the Middle East. There's the rainy season and there's the non-rainy season. That's about what they have. November to March, the rainy season. April to October, the dry season. Very little in between. The crop farmers in the Middle East use all the arable ground that there is. The shepherds, they're forced to the marginal areas of that arable land. The areas where the arable land meets the wilderness. And it's on that margin there that the goat herders and the sheep herders eke out an existence. The city of Bethlehem is an example. It stands on the margin between the fertile land that can raise crops and the wilderness where you can't raise crops. And you might be familiar with stories like the story of Boaz and Ruth meeting Boaz, and the story there is he's threshing grain and Ruth comes along and Naomi sends her daughter-in-law there, and long story short, a few generations later, David is born. He was a crop farmer. David was raised by his family in the same town, Bethlehem, as a sheep farmer. So where the arable land meets the wilderness is Bethlehem, and the 2 types of farming occur there right on that margin. David was a shepherd, and he writes about green pastures. Now, in the non-rainy time, where are these green pastures? I showed you a few slides in the non-rainy time of where David raised his sheep, the Judea wilderness, and there's not a tinge of green to be found. And yet they're out there every day, eking out an existence. And their flocks, in fact, are thriving. Today, the nomadic Bedouin herdsmen raise sheep and goats together. Very rarely do you see one animal without the other in the Middle East, sheep and goats. And here's a flock of them just out of Bethlehem in the Judea wilderness, sort of scattered everywhere and generally heading in that direction from left to right there. And as you walk a little bit further, you see why they're walking that way. They're walking that way because the shepherd is leading the way. The shepherd's never behind them. He doesn't use a dog, and he very rarely uses any words. He simply gets his donkey and off he goes. And when the sheep and the goats see him going, they move. They all form ranks and they walk off. To see it in action just blows you away, because I don't see it in action here. Not with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sheep and goats at a time do I ever see that here, but I did all the time in the Middle East. It's an amazing sight to see. Here we're driving up through central Israel towards Samaria, the northern kingdom of Israel in Old Testament times, and out the bus window again, I couldn't get my camera out quick enough and take photos. Here's a very large herd of sheep and goats, and I just click, 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 click out the window, and I'm thinking, why are they all walking in the same direction? It's because that's the one guy that's looking after that mob of sheep and goats on his own. And he's taking them from one place to another across many, many kilometres up and over hills. Never needs to look behind because he knows the sheep and goats will be there. Why? Because where's he leading them? To the next pasture for feed, for the next drink of water that they'll need. They very quickly learn from the day they're born that you rely on this guy and you get to know his voice. This is in Petra, it's in Jordan, one of the great wonders of the world. If you ever get to go there, it's an amazing sight. But even in Petra, there's little goat herders with far smaller sheep. You can see a guy sitting by the rock there. I snapped his photo. And his sheep and goats are off over the hills wandering around. But as soon as he gets up and starts to walk, they'll come from everywhere to form their mob and follow him where he goes. This is in the centre of Bethlehem today, through the main streets of Bethlehem. I snapped out of the bus window, a flock of goats and sheep coming up from the valleys down below and about to cross the main road in central Bethlehem, and all the traffic stops. Where's the farmer? At the top of the hill. What are the sheep doing? Following him wherever he goes. They'll stop there. When the traffic stops, he'll lead them all across the road and away they'll go. The shepherd and the sheep. In Nazareth today, they have a little village, a bit like we in Warren will have Flagstaff Hill, Maritime Village, because of the maritime history in this part of the world. In Nazareth, they've set up a first century village of what Nazareth may have looked like in the time of Jesus when he grew up there. And they have their shepherds dressed in what they think was first century gear, and they have the sheep pens made in the same way the shepherds in Bethlehem would have used, or in Nazareth would have used when they're out on the hills. And thorny bushes grabbed to make a makeshift gate so the sheep don't get out at night when they pen them up. Oh, and you think, wow, it's interesting to see the way they do farming. I said before, they still farm in the same way as they did in King David's time or in Jesus' time. The only difference today is that they have trailers and tractors and water tankers to bring water out there, but everything else is the same. They've been living in those sheepskin, those goatskin tents since David was a boy. And it's still done this way today. This is green pastures in David's time, in the summertime, when he wrote the 23rd Psalm. You think, what do they eat? They're not trucking in bales of hay for them to eat. They're not supplementing the feed. They're feeding in the wilderness, in the summertime, in the green pastures that are there. And you say, where are these green pastures? See a little mob of sheep together and the goats scattered everywhere. Brought to mind the parable of the sheep and the goats that Jesus once told as I was driving past there before my eyes. Oh, there's some wild ibex in the Judea wilderness, and they head down and they're eating, and I was wondering when I took that photo, what on earth are they eating? It looks like they're eating rocks. But if you get close enough and you get down and you look between the rocks, you'll see here and there a blade of grass, literally a little tuft here and a little tuft there. Enough for them to survive today. And this is what the Middle Eastern shepherds are still doing today. They'll take them to the Judea wilderness, to places, even though it's not rained for months and months, they'll take them where they know a little bit of moisture will settle at night, a little bit of condensation will cause the moisture to form water droplets, enough for a blade of grass to grow here and a tuft there and a little bit over there. But they know scattered around this area, there will be enough for their flock perhaps for today, and then tomorrow they'll have to take them somewhere else. And the following day, they'll have to take them somewhere else. That's why in the Middle East, even today, there are no fences. There are no paddocks to keep stock in. The stock go where the farmer goes. They follow the shepherd. Why? Because the shepherd knows where these little tufts will be at different times of the year, particularly in the summertime. So when David writes, he leads me beside still waters, he makes me lie down in green pastures, there's no irrigation there. There are no knee-high paddocks of grasses that you're growing for sheep here in the Western District that we grow for our cattle or you grow for your sheep around. They just don't exist in the summertime. There's enough nutrient for today if they're lucky. Tomorrow they'll move on and find something else. Even though the stock will eat all the grass in one day, the sheep don't worry about where tomorrow's food's going to come from. They know the shepherd will find new pastures for them. They'll be on the move again. And if they're smart enough, they'll follow closely enough behind him so that they will get all their needs met tomorrow. But they won't have those needs for tomorrow met until tomorrow. Keep that in mind. So the 23rd Psalm, the image of God providing green pastures for me today, is a challenging one. I think it's a challenge for all believers, because what David's saying is, if you need to trust in God for his every provision, yes, but there's no guarantee that God's provision for next week for you will come today. Maybe it will. David's experience was not that when he wrote this psalm. David's experience was God will provide for his tomorrow, tomorrow. As the sheep trusted the farmer for their feed tomorrow, tomorrow. I think, wow. See, the Good Shepherd doesn't promise a life of luxury or long-term supplies, but he'll always provide the pasture needed for the moment. But we worry, don't we, today? We want assurances about how things will turn out. We want to be in control is what we're really wanting, isn't it? I want to know that I will have all my needs met for next week, for next month, for next year, for the day that I retire and settle down. I think David would tell us in the 23rd Psalm, worrying about tomorrow's needs is like worrying about something without having the needs there, having the provision there. David would say, worry about tomorrow don't worry about tomorrow, because when tomorrow comes, God's provision will be there. That was his experience as a kid, looking after his father's sheep in this very area in June, July and August, where there is no rain. There is no green pastures as we would think of pastures. David lived out that life of relationship that God wanted him to have with his sheep on a daily basis as a kid growing up. And he knew his sheep could trust him. And in turn, David knew as a sheep, he could also trust his God in exactly the same way. You may not see it now, but the new tuft of grass, the provision you need for tomorrow is there. But God doesn't always provide that today. He'll provide it for you when you need it, often. And I think that's one of the messages that I take of the 23rd Psalm. Am I wise enough to stay close to the shepherd? And am I patient enough to wait for the shepherd to get me to my provision tomorrow? Because it probably won't be to tomorrow until I get that tomorrow's provision. And lastly, shepherd, green pastures and quiet waters or still waters. What does that mean? How had David understood that when he wrote those words? The most frequent cause of death in the wilderness. What might you think that would be? The most frequent cause of death in wilderness areas in the Middle East today. Things like perhaps dehydration might come to mind, thirst, heat stroke. I don't know, I might get lost. I might starve. You can look this up if you like. You don't have to take my word for it. The most common form of death in the wilderness areas of the Middle East today is drowning. Now you think, what? You've just showed me all these slides that say there's no water for 6 months of the year. And in that area, more people die of drowning than they do thirst, of starvation or being lost. Yes, they do. How? Why? Well, although the wilderness areas get very little rain, the central mountain areas where places like Jerusalem exist get a great deal of rain when the time it does rain. And in fact, it might surprise you, I don't know how good your geography is, that Jerusalem receives as much annual rainfall as London. Now that surprises most people. It surprised me when I first learned that too. Here's the difference. In Israel, with Jerusalem sitting on that central mountain range where it is, there is no topsoil, or it might be millimetres thick at most. So when it does rain and rain heavy, what happens to all that water? It simply runs off. And where is Jerusalem situated? On the mountain ridge about 3,000 feet above sea level. Where does it run? East and west. It can't run north-south until it gets down off the mountains. It runs east and west. It runs west down to the Mediterranean Sea. It runs east through the Judea wilderness into the Dead Sea. And then when it gets off the mountain range, it'll eventually make its way down south into the Negev wilderness. And wherever it's running, through valleys, we'll call it a valley, the Middle Eastern people will call it a wadi. These wadis fill extraordinarily quickly, and we know the concept, I'm sure, of flash flooding. And it's flash flooding in these wadis in wilderness areas each year, when it does rain up on the hill country near Jerusalem, that causes the drownings. Jerusalem sits on the top of that mountain range, away to the south, west and south of there. This is a place called En-Gedi. David found himself living with his men at En-Gedi when King Saul was after him, trying to take his life. He was jealous of David. You might remember that story. It was at this place, in one of those wadis there that you can see, that David held out, escaped from Saul. It's a very fertile wadi because when it rains on the central mountain ridge near Jerusalem, the water drains to the east down those wadis. Very, very little is soaked up. And massive amounts of water come flowing down there towards the Dead Sea at the bottom. And it could be as dry as chips at the bottom and the blue sky and sunshine and hot and yet you can die of a flash flood. Why? Because 20, 30, 40 kilometres away, there's a cloudburst. And that water runs off the limestone mountain ridge very quickly down into wadis like that. And a little stream becomes a rushing torrent that washes people away today to their deaths who are hiking in these areas if they're not got an eye on the weather forecast. And you can look up and see blue skies and you think this is good, and washed away half an hour later because it was raining somewhere else and you weren't aware of it. So here's one of those wadis. You can hike up that wadi there to a little waterfall at En-Gedi where David spent a lot of his time and wrote probably psalms like the 23rd Psalm in that spot there. It's the Dead Sea in the background there, and it's it's a big wadi. There's a group of hikers in a circle down there, so you can see the valley's pretty big. Other wadis look like this, and you can imagine hiking along there when a flash flood comes down the canyon. There's no way to escape it. You're in it. Now, after floodwaters like that come crashing down these canyons or these wadis, they eventually dissipate and run out into the desert or into the Dead Sea, and you're left with little clear, cool, still pockets of water. I'm thinking, is this the quiet water David was talking about? He leads me beside still waters or quiet waters. No, they're not. This is not quiet water that David was talking about. Gee, it looks inviting though, doesn't it? If you're a shepherd and your sheep were thirsty, this is a place you'd want to take them. But it might take you a kilometre or two up that wadi to get to it. You're going to risk it. The shepherd would have known certain times of the year, even though that looks good, that would satisfy my sheep's needs, I'm not going to take them there today because there's a big chance that we'll never get out if a flash flood comes down. The experience of the shepherd knows to distinguish between what's a great opportunity that, hey, we shouldn't miss this opportunity. Quiet water's going to meet all our needs. Let's go for it. God's put it there for us. Well, it's there, but it's not necessarily God's put it there for us. The wise shepherd knows that walking through a wadi can be dangerous. They know where to find springs of water that will quench the stock's thirst that are not dangerous. And so they might bypass this opportunity for a safer one. Now, how do I relate to that? I think today, as sheep of God's pastures, I think we too thirst for water like this that quenches. God, give me this quiet water. I need my needs met. That's going to meet my needs. Surely I must take this opportunity. Maybe, and maybe not. Is every opportunity that appears good an opportunity that we should grasp? I don't know. I think David would say, think carefully. Maybe we need to pray about it. Is this a wise thing to do? Yes, it might meet my needs. It's everything I was after, but should I take it? David would say, be careful before you make that choice. And so what do we quench? What are we after that quenches our needs? Yeah, maybe it's careers. God, a job, please. Lifestyle, relationships, if only. Activities that bring pleasure. Finances, Lord, you know I need the finances. I'm out of work. I'm doing it tough. And there's all these things we bring to God, and an opportunity comes along, and do we grasp it or don't we grasp it? Such water is attractive and even appears safe. The sky is blue, the sun is warm. It looks so right. But little might we know that the storm clouds are gathering on the other side of the mountain ridge as we speak, as we reach out to grasp them. Only our shepherd knows where to find springs of living water that are not in dangerous places. Quiet waters, David talks about. Still waters, David talks about, are waters that not only look like this and meet our needs, but they're opportunities that are right for us, that are safe for us at the same time. Because being right for us and safe for us are not always the same things. And I think this is one of the lessons from the 23rd Psalm that I need to be reminded of. So as I conclude, let me say this. God disciplined his people of old for their lack of faith, for their disobedience and their complaining in the wilderness. Moses tells them that God humbled them so that they would learn to depend on him for everything. That was the story of the children of Israel for 40 years under Moses' leadership when they came out of Egypt. They needed to learn the lesson that God wanted them to learn. Who is he? God says, I am your shepherd. Who are you? God says, you are my sheep. What do sheep do? They follow the shepherd close enough so that when danger comes, they can be rescued. Close enough so that each day when he moves, they move, because in him every need was met. The shepherd and the sheep, God leading his people of Israel through the wilderness in 40 years. It took them 40 years to learn that lesson, but eventually they did learn it, and eventually Joshua will take them into the promised land. Learn they did. This is a spring up in the north of Israel, spring of Harod. It's called Gideon's Spring. It's the spring where Gideon took his men. If you know the story of Gideon and the Midianites, this spring comes out of a cave, a rock in the cave there, flows down, forms a little stream, and you can drink at it even to today, just as Gideon's men did. It's a safe place to go drink water. It bubbles up out of the ground. It's a gentle little spring. It's been flowing since the time of Gideon. It still flows today. A safe place to drink, a place where this is quiet water, not water in the bottom of a canyon. The shepherds knew to distinguish. So we come back to our shepherd sitting on the hill today. Long before he was Israel's greatest king and called the man after God's own heart, David was prepared for his role as a shepherd. And the lessons that he learned made such an impact on them that he wrote them down for us. So my hope this morning is that the 23rd Psalm continues to be a reminder to you of how God wants our relationship with him to be. We, the dependent sheep, willing to follow, and him, the providing shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore. We heard some therefores this morning as that passage was read. Can I share some others with you? Therefore, from the first two verses this morning, he can be trusted to lead me safely through my life if I choose to follow closely and realise when he walks, I walk. Where he goes, I go. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore he can be trusted to provide tomorrow's pasture. But more often than not, when will that need be met? When the time comes for it to be met, not 3 months in advance, necessarily. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore he can be trusted to quench my thirst, not with any water, but with quiet water, still water, water that is right for me, for you, in the situation we find ourselves in day by day.